is an African-American vernacular English term and is normally a derogatory way to refer to women, especially black women, as being promiscuous within the male gaze, end quote. They go on to say that using the term in an arbitrary way diminishes its harmful origin in light of something better. Another Art Ho Collective member, Sage Adams, expressed a similar approach to reclaiming the term, arguing that it's important that it's called Art Ho's because we want to define how we're being seen. So we get to choose our narrative. We get to represent ourselves. The second project that I focus on is called The Melanin Diary, and it's a blog started by Shanice Lee, who was 15 years old at the time of the blog's debut. In her mission statement, Lee explains that she started The Melanin Diary, quote, for innovative and intellectual black teens as a place to come for all things social justice, history, politics, and current events. One of Lee's main objectives is to change narratives about the perception of black teenagers. She argues that black teens are seen as criminals, threats, or just another statistic, and, quote, I've decided that I'm going to make it my business to end this false narrative. In contrast to the shallow conceptualizations of black youth, Lee describes black children as intelligent, creative, powerful, and capable of doing amazing things. Finally, Marley Dias's 1,000 Black Girl Books campaign is an initiative born out of her frustration with reading about white boys and their dogs. Those are her words. In one interview for NPR's Morning Edition, Dias stated, I was frustrated because I was never reading books about black girls or any other type of character. So I decided to start a campaign in which black girls are the main character and then give those books to various schools. In explaining her big picture approach, Dias notes that teachers assign books that you must read. If those books are not diverse and do not show different people's experiences, then kids are going to believe that there is only one type of experience that matters. For Dias, black girl books are not just for black girls, they're for all children. And I should add that she was 11 years old when she started this campaign. So even though all three of these projects take on different forms and have different missions, each of them has been effective in using social media platforms as a way of enacting change surrounding issues that impact black girls. One way that these projects serve black girls' political agendas is through consciousness raising. Consciousness raising lies at the heart of activist projects like those from Shanice Lee through the Melanin Diary, and she couples this practice with outlining concrete ways for black youth to become involved in activist efforts once they confront newfound knowledge about social injustices. For example, in one of Lee's blog posts called The Ultimate Guide to Being a Successful Youth Activist, she identifies 4 key components of youth activism that have been cornerstones of her own work: passion, education, joining organizations, and utilizing social media. Lee does not limit her definition of education to formal or classroom education. In fact, throughout the Melanin Diary, Lee and her guest bloggers often criticize education systems for deliberately withholding information that would equip black youth with adequate tools to understand and assess the world around them. Lee emphasizes the importance of engaging in both locally based organizations and digital activism. While joining local organizations and attending local events can lead to the establishment of a support system of people who have the same goals, Lee argues that black youth can also use social media to create spaces for themselves. She recognizes that not all activism has to look the same, but she uses her own experiences as a way to encourage other black youth to work towards social change. Another key intervention that these projects make is that of visibilizing or representing a wide range of black identities and experiences. For instance, the Art Ho Collective's use of selfies encourages self-love, which both critiques and counters exclusion of people of color from mainstream art. While some people might view selfies as a manifestation of narcissism, marginalized people's deployment of selfies can take on specific political functions. The Art Ho Collective's use of selfies fits within both a genealogy of black people politicizing the self-portrait and the contemporary moment in which the selfie indicates a specific form of resistance to being erased within digital spaces. With the Melanin Diary, Shanice Lee fights against limited portrayals of Black teenagers by encouraging you to make their own narratives and inviting other Black girls to contribute to the Melanin Diary as guest bloggers. And of course, the 1,000 Black Girl Books campaign engages in visibilizing Black girlhood by first acknowledging that books with Black girl protagonists do actually exist, and then working to make sure that children have access to these stories. Finally, all of these projects engage in acts of space making that are crucial to the lives and work of Black girls and non-binary teens. In addition to exceeding the goals of the 1,000 Black Girl Books campaign, Marleigh Dias has catapulted her activism into a guest editorship with Elle magazine and a book deal with Scholastic. During her guest editorship with Elle, which was the first of its kind, Dias put together an online zine for Elle's website called the Marleigh Mag. The zine features a range of content, including interviews with people like Misty Copeland, Hillary Clinton, Ava DuVernay, and Larry Wilmore. In the opening letter of the zine, Dias notes, quote, "My passion for books has changed my life. Between school, homework, tests, and playtime with my friends, I have worked my butt off to create this space where Black girl stories are read and celebrated in schools and libraries." She goes on to say, "I have one goal. I want to change the way we imagine Black girls in books and in culture, and I want to create new spaces for Black girls to be represented." Marleigh Dias' case exemplifies how the internet facilitates a deconstruction of boundaries, both conceptual and institutional, that typically serve as a hindrance to Black girls. Both the 1,000 Black Girl Books campaign and Marleigh Mag show how online platforms open up opportunities and possibilities for Black girls to be included in both traditional and new media spaces. With the Melanin Diary and the Art Ho Collective, they also have a similar focus on creating spaces for Black girls and Black youth as a whole. In addition to inviting guest bloggers to the Melanin Diary, Shanice Lee highlights the work of other Black teen activists and entrepreneurs. Therefore, even though Lee is the founder and primary contributor to the blog, she presents it as a communal space for Black youth to get free. With the Art Ho Collective, one of the ways that the group has been intentional about seeking and sharing work of people of color is through an Instagram curation where artists can submit their work. As indicated in the various interviews with Mars and in journalist analyses, many members of the Art Ho Collective utilize selfies and self-portraits to make a range of statements about what constitutes art and who gets to make it. In addition to the art itself, part of the Art Ho Collective's political value lies in its mission and how it operates. Co-founder Mars describes the collective as a place where, quote, "We give marginalized groups a platform to feel safe while also broadcasting their art." In this way, the Art Ho Collective recognizes the importance not only of having a platform, which is crucial to exposing artists' work, but also creating a safe haven where such communities may not exist without the work of the Art Ho Collective. Ultimately, digital platforms have been essential to Black girls' participation in media production and distribution. Digital media platforms such as Instagram and YouTube have allowed Black girls the ability to share their own media productions without depending on middle people or gatekeepers to relay their messages. And the work of the Art Ho Collective, Shanice Lee, and Marleigh Dias illustrate what might be possible when Black girls' voices are amplified through digital media. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Raven Rush. Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Hi, my name is Maragh Lloyd. I'm an assistant professor just starting in August at Gonzaga University. I'm really excited to be here today, and thank you to the organizers of this wonderful, wonderful conference. I'm taking in a lot today, and it's been amazing. Okay, so I'm going to present a piece of my research that I've been working on for the last 1.5 to 2 years, titled The Meeting Place, the Decolonizing Cyberspace of Black Women and Resistance. We can talk later about digital representations of resistance and masculinity, like you see in the picture here, and we can discuss, like I said, later. So I'll start with one of my focus group participants, and I'll talk about my methodology specifically in just a minute. In keeping with sort of the conference theme of centering Black experiences and Black voices, right? So I start with one of my focus group participants who mentions my Instagram page. Well, first and foremost, definitely let somebody know that I'm very pro-Black. I'm just all here for Black people. So my research and this talk that I'll briefly give today is about sort of this relationship between social network sites and Black women specifically, and how the digital space sort of gets transformed through Black women's resistance. So first, I ask, what kinds of everyday resistance strategies, if any, do Black women employ online? And I'll talk about what I mean by everyday resistance. And then second, I'm wondering how these strategies reveal and or circumvent the digital post-racial. And again, I'll talk about what I mean by the digital post-racial. Apologies in advance for the text-heavy slide. So I first rely on Patricia Hill Collins' framework of Black feminist thought, which, and that's supposed to say 2000, so I apologize, 1990, 2000, which first questions objective truth, right, and centers Black women and Black women's lived experiences, as she says, in defining our own realities on our own terms. And then second, Black feminist thought allows us to approach identities and oppressions as interlocking, right, as opposed to hierarchical. So I'll talk about race and gender. I don't talk about sexuality in this presentation, but in the larger paper, I talk about different intersections of these interlocking identities as, again, not hierarchical, but they make their way online in interesting ways. And then secondly, I'm pulling from the digital post-racial and post-feminist literature. So quite a few folks have written about this tension between digital technologies and this idea of the post-racial or post-feminist, right? Like racism is fixed, we're good because we have technology, and quote, everybody has access online now, right? So Sophia Noble has written about search engines as supposedly value neutral, and she critiques this idea. Jesse Daniels and others have written about the interconnected circuits of color blindness in the internet. Anna Everett, of course, and Andre Brock has also written about sort of these post-racial promises of web browsers. And then other folks have written about the countercultural and anti-authoritarian ethos of technology. So MacBooks in the 1970s, Fred Turner writes about as inherently anti-authoritarian, therefore people thought, because we have technology, again, these systems of oppression no longer exist, right, the post-racial. And so, again, in my talk, I'm wondering how Black women's resistance circumvent or reveal the post-racial online. I specifically do so through two online logics of individuality and networked influence. And then third, I am interested in everyday resistance. So Catherine Knight Steele has written about Black women in alternate public spaces, so on gossip blogs and in the larger blogosphere, as Black women talk back, right, to power structures in seemingly apolitical sites. And so I'm interested in resistance and activism as in non-traditional ways and non-traditional spaces. I'm also relying on James C. Scott's idea of infrapolitics here, so sort of the seemingly, or the circumspect struggle, he writes, waged daily by subordinate groups, which like infrared rays, I really like that visual, infrared rays beyond the visible end of the spectrum, which is a tactical choice, he writes, so it's not supposed to necessarily be visible to everyone. And then Robert D.G. Kelly continues with the hidden transcripts. Christine Atcham is extending this to media studies. So hidden transcripts then are these seemingly innocuous individualistic acts of survival. So I'm interested in this interplay between hidden transcripts and the post-racial as well, as both seem to be seemingly innocuous, right? Again, so my research questions there of what kinds of everyday resistance strategies, if any, do Black women employ, and then how do these strategies reveal or circumvent the post-racial? And these questions really serve to point to Patricia Collins' point about power and agency, right, of Black women and their interrelated domains of power, she writes, as responsive to human agency. So again, that tension between power and agency. My methodology, I will go quickly through this in the interest of time, but happy to go back to it if we have questions. So I conducted 5 focus groups of 20 Black women total that lasted 50 to 75 minutes about in St. Louis, Missouri. And the ages were between 22 to 25. Again, I'm happy to talk later about the citations and why I chose, where I chose, and demographics, et cetera, all of which were intentional. And then I put some brief demographic information up here in terms of education and economic standing of the women. In terms of occupations, the women stemmed from stay-at-home moms to insurance coordinators, pastors, baristas, leasing consultants, teachers, students, et cetera. I also meant to point out the 20 women included both Black and African-American women. So for me, as a Black West Indian woman, I'm always sort of interested in Blackness and the diaspora of Blackness. So I was grateful to have, the majority of women were African-American women, but I had folks from Nigeria, from the Caribbean, et cetera. Okay, so my first theme, so I'll say too, what focus groups allowed me to do was to identify and analyze sort of these complex intersectional identities and oppressions offline that led to really thought-provoking and thought-out intentional resistance online. So a lot of these oppressions are not new, right? And folks have written about them for quite a while, but I'm interested, again, in this sort of relationship between offline identities and oppressions and what that means online. So almost across all the groups, the women talked about hindrances that they experience offline that led to sort of their resistance online, again, in seemingly innocuous ways. So hair came up, of course, as a big factor. Folks said, like the second quote there, I find myself at 28 years old still worrying and going to interviews. What do I want to do with my hair? Another person mentioned, I just thought it was so ironic to get a job shortly after combing out my locks. So then what came up was my profile pictures then are me with my natural hair, and a lot of those photos I don't show here because they have people's faces in them, right? But the profile pictures were intentionally chosen, the women mentioned, because of these offline experiences where their bodies, their hair is a disruption in these spaces, and so their online profiles were a place for them to disrupt, right? So these visual signifiers were a sense of resistance for the women. And then, again, I don't show the pictures because they have the women's faces on them, but I included the comments where somebody's mentioning when your hair is popping. So it's a sort of like self-celebration of hair, and again, the online space as disrupting other people's places where the women felt like they were a disruption offline. Somebody said, he likes me with my locks, so I got my hair straightened. So in the interview, someone mentioned she is a bank manager and she was going up for a promotion to the investment sector of the bank. And in the interview, the boss asked, are you going to start wearing your hair like that? I like it straight. And as she was going up for promotion and saying, you're going to have to deal with more high caliber clients, so you need to straighten your hair. So again, where she didn't necessarily feel like she could talk back to that interviewer, her online space was a place where she was unapologetic, like we've been talking about. And then the second major part of resistance I'll quickly talk about was this idea of sharing news articles and podcasts, also as a way of self-protection online. So people mentioned I could post this article without a comment, so if somebody goes and gives it to my boss, so what? What are they going to say, right? So they shared podcasts, shared articles. They're letting news sources speak for them. I'll point out the piece here about I'm letting them, so that's a sense of agency there. They're letting the news sources say something, again, pointing to this idea of self-protection offline. And then this idea of hypersexuality came up, of course, so this trope of, as someone mentioned, unfortunately, I think as a black woman, you can't show your sense of sexuality if you're a professional, so that's a caveat there, if you're a professional. So class also comes up here. How dare you be a multi-dimensional person, the person says. And so for them, they share news stories as a way to resist online in sort of seemingly innocuous ways, and to avoid trolls. So in terms of what this does or what this means to the digital, my first sort of lens, and I'll go very quickly, my first sort of lens is individuality. So this is the idea that every user's empowered, right? We all have the empowerment to find technology, and again, the post-racial, we're good. What the women showed was this idea of that's not the case, right, for everyone. So intersectionality says and shows that there are these social constraints, right, offline, that the women, additional social constraints that black women have to deal with offline that make their way online. So you'll see that in the quote here, how do we speak our mind? Because of these tropes of hypersexuality, of, as this person's pointing to, the angry black woman, right? So for the women, they, what I argue, reveal sort of that the digital cannot contend for these offline constraints when they go online. Sorry, I'm trying to rush. And then secondly, this idea of networked influence, so the idea of democratizing functions of digital technologies. What rises to the top is the most popular. That's the whole post-racial idea. And the women also sort of circumvent this idea, because what rises to the top or what's most popular, most credible, is not always what black women say when they resist, right? So this idea of race and gender came in, where some women talked about, I have to choose my race over my gender. So one woman is an academic coach and has conversations online about, for example, the school to prison pipeline, and says, for better or for worse, she starts with conversation on black men to get to conversations of black girls. So within her networks, she still has to struggle, right, with her dominant sort of racial group and dominant gender groups. And so this idea of what's most popular floating to the top isn't necessarily the case, isn't always the case. Okay, so contributions. I'm interested and hoping that this work makes some contributions in terms of offline intersectional identities and experiences to online resistance, and then these everyday forms of resistance and discussions of activism online and sort of rethinking activism, and then reading the post-racial and these underlying functions of technologies that are called into question by black women online. So thank you very much.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to share some of my dissertation research with you today. This presentation is part of an ongoing project supported by the African American History, Culture, and Digital Humanities grant right here at the University of Maryland, and which is through the Mellon Foundation. Let me make sure I know how to use this. Okay. Since the first Africans have found their way to the United States, black people have often channeled their expressive culture and available technologies to develop and maintain methods for political communication in public space. These methods are used during political mobilization as well as periods of abeyance. As Robert Ferris Thompson notes of the West African expression of the cool, black cultural expression privileges the capacity to be nonchalant at the right moment while being able to demonstrate control of political and social pressure. Black activism on Twitter continues this tradition by utilizing Black collective action frames and manipulation of Twitter's discursive style to capitalize on the political value of the gaze generated from hashtags and trending topics. As the first born digital African-American political movement, the movement for Black survival in the era of Black Lives Matter carries on the cultural practice of signifying, which is synonymous with Thompson's concept of the cool. Signifying draws upon cultural resources to engage social media platforms, specifically Facebook and Twitter, to enact a performance of a metaphorical play, vagueness, and duality of meanings produced simultaneously to communicate. So for the purposes of this research, I ask how Black activists utilize Twitter to carry on Black cultural traditions for collective action, which is the focus of this presentation. In particular, I look at how Black activists conceptualize and perform hope in the highly surveilled digital public. Specifically, I ask, how do Black activists conceptualize hope? How do Black activists use Twitter to communicate those ideas of hope and survival? How does the practice of conceptualizing and building hope collectively over social media connect to offline activism? And how does Black activists' online cultural practice contribute to the continuity of Black social movements? In what follows, I apply an adaptation of critical technocultural discourse analysis, as articulated by Andre Brock, to argue that African American activists have utilized signifying practices to communicate emancipatory hope. I conceptualize emancipatory hope as a utopian expectation of the collective capacity for dismantling race, class, and gender dominance. During periods of social movement abeyance, like the one we're currently in, I suggest that Black social movement actors use the framework of hope, the framework of emancipatory hope, to pass emancipatory knowledge from one period of movement mobilization to the next. I examine activist constructions and applications of hope through shared artifacts of political engagement across Twitter. This research uses about 300,000 tweets. The data represents 108 user accounts with about 8 men, 44 women, and one openly identified trans account, trans woman specifically. And 55 of the accounts were organizational accounts, meaning the organization of Black Lives Matter or a regional chapter. On average, about 2,880 tweets were collected per user due to the restrictions placed on Twitter's API. I began with a propulsive snowball sampling of known activists and activist organizations and found their members and allied organizations through official websites and Twitter follows. So, critical technocultural discourse analysis is a methodological approach for the study of digital phenomena that integrates analysis of the technocultural artifact, in this case, a social media platform, and user discourse framed through cultural theories such as critical race theory. By engaging both the interface of Twitter, its uses, and significant cultural practices, along with a content analysis of Black activist online discussion, I identify the technocultural political framing of the current movement for Black lives. CTDA affords the analysis of both the Black activist content of Twitter through an intersectional collective action frame alignment perspective that provides space for both a critical lens on race, class, and social movements, and an analysis of how the structure and services of Twitter contribute to the content generated within its platform. I draw my theoretical framework from Hunt et al.'s work on framing process and the social construction of movement identities. The frame alignment process, which is the linkage of individual and collective interpretive orientations such that some set of individual interests, values, and beliefs, and collective activities, goals, and ideologies are harmonious. Under this framework, there are 3 elements: the framing task, movement identity, and movement goals. So under framing tasks, we have frames that do the work of describing the problem and assigning blame. And then we have the prognostic frame, which does the work of figuring out solutions and identifying heroic figures, figures that become charismatic leaders. And then the motivational frame does just that, does the work of motivating people from being audience members or bystanders into activists, or to actually physically go do something. This framing process then produces movement identities, protagonist figures, hero figures, antagonist figures, and audience members who collectively come together to then produce an activist scene. And all of this is done to produce basically 2 types of goals: to either build consensus or to move people into action. So in my preliminary findings, you'll see above that about 50% of the tweets that I identified fall within the protagonist frame, which is something that I sort of expected. We spent much more of our time actually trying to find solutions to the problem than there were tweets just not necessarily complaining, but repeating over and over again tweets that just identified a problem and left it as that, right? And then the next largest section of this was the motivational framing. So think about different elements of the timeline that would then make up the Black Lives Matter movement, right? So let's think about, let's say, Trump's election, right? There was the, oh my God moment, what is this? But within black activist spaces, they very much already knew what this was, right? So it wasn't as much a discussion on what this was as much as, okay, this is where we are now, this is what we're still capable of, and this is what we need to do now, right? And that's very much reflected in the frequency of those types of tweets. As I moved into my findings early on, I realized that my initial theoretical framework needed adjusting, as social movement scholars study movements often in peak mobilization, meaning when it's time, when it's popular to do the movement. However, the question I had was, what does this process look like for movements that are in abeyance? Or in other words, when it's not necessarily popular to do this movement. And I would argue that the current movement for Black Lives is absolutely a movement that's in abeyance because the leader of our country is a tyrant. And historically, as we understand movements, movements do not operate under autocrats. So moving into some of the data here, here we see both an example of motivational framing and prognostic framing and antagonist framing. Whereas research has often noted this combination in times where mobilization is more socially acceptable by political and social elites, here we see a combination used primarily as an act of self and collective care. And I'll read the tweet out loud because I know the live stream can't see it. Hashtag yes, hashtag Trump, and the Republican Party is triggering as fuck for black people. I say this to say that black people, we have power. Nobody's going to save us but us. I love black people. Hashtag let's get free, right? So in this tweet, we have multiple things doing multiple types of work, right? But within the hashtag of let's get free, there's certainly a motivation, a care happening, trying to maintain spirits in this traumatic time. And if you also look at the date of this is right in the middle of a time of high trauma as it relates to Trump and his, well, all times is a time of high trauma as we deal with Trump, but I move on. So I'm using a software package called NVivo, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the machine learning process and how that I have to be mindful of Black cultural expression through machine learning software. So as I try to identify concepts of hope, I get outputs that look much like what you see on the screen. And because machine learning sometimes misses some of our cultural practices, things like shade, right? When we throw shade, that I have to be extra mindful of programming our software to best identify it where it can, but always be mindful that it's going to miss most of it, right? So to say that in a DH space is to say that, yes, some of these tools help us do things faster, but we also have to be mindful of they were created oftentimes by white men using white programming language, and it was not very much designed with us in mind, right? Moving into some of the other examples here, I conceptualize emancipatory hope again as a utopian expectation of the collective capacity for dismantling race, class, and gender dominance. So we see in the two tweets above that we're using motivational framing, but we're also using some of the prognostic framing here. So we see that that we can organize around the fact that 80% of us did not vote for Trump. We can build on this rebellion and build a sanctuary, right? So then the hashtag does several things here. It's first communicating on a very much a surface level of producing, again, a certain level of care, but then as you search in this, you can also identify a community of folks who are both thinking about these things, but are also actively looking for community to organize, right? So hashtags are very much searchable, right? In contrast, I also found that the protagonist, motivational, and prognostic fields often overlay with each other. With both of these tweets have in common is a call to action focused more generally, as the focus of the movement has shifted to local politics and sustaining itself through an authoritarian government. So very much all of this to say is that in this period, which is June 3rd, 2018, as we've settled into a Trump's presidency, many of the tweets that I've identified have now started to focus inward, not necessarily worried about what we can change within our government and other external social structures, but mostly focusing on what we can change in ourselves and within our own organizations just to survive the moment, which is why I believe that we're in this time of abeyance. What we're focusing on is our own survival and our movement survival more so than this external act of change. So I found this tweet that was particularly interesting because the Center for Media Justice is right at this intersection of DH and activism. In fact, that they find a certain level of enjoy that so while others have used data to our detriment, that this particular community have used data to also produce hope. So I found a little bit of a shared brotherhood here. But consistent with Black feminist political thought, I find that not only is it the personal political, but so is hope. That it can serve as a framing vehicle by which strategies, tactics, and emotional toolkits can be passed to one another in the public gaze. We can literally talk in public without them knowing what we're talking about because of our cultural practices. And we can use the framing of hope to embed all of these strategies and tactics in very much traditions that that occur way before Twitter was ever even thought of, right? This study adds to social movement continuity research by considering the role that digital plays in abeyance formations. But I also should add that this study also adds to the field of social movements because we're first starting with Black theories, Black feminist theories, and in a field that has excluded very often, particularly Black women, but Black people in general. And our theories on race, our theories on power has been excluded from this field for way too long, and yet still black people oftentimes become the subject of study in the field of social movements. This study demonstrates how online space can recenter discourse framing research and act as a catalyst for collective identity formation and maintenance. Hope in movements is an under-theorized concept that I believe has implications for how we understand the how and why individuals mobilize into and sustain their collective action. This is particularly true for movements like Black Lives Matter that faces a hostile political climate in the face of a tyrant such as President Cheeto. Thank you. So at this point, we want to use the remaining. Oh, we have quite a bit of time. Okay, so the remaining time for questions. So if you can raise your hand, and we will get that part of the show going. Yep.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Question with regards to speaking about the concept of online, the work that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
My research specifically, I got a call one time, presented it someday, because if my work looks at something like Greece,
Mm-hmm.
the relationship that they have, or the technical relationship they have with technology and access.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, all this work that you presented in your research, respectively, how do you cross that divide in socioeconomic and making sure that this work is so important and accessible to a wider audience? And then part two to that is also, it seems a little bit ageist in the fact that Pew Research in 2016 decided that only 59% of senior citizens have access to digital technology of any kind, and those senior citizens made $75,000 or more, had bachelor's and degrees. And so I was wondering, how do we get this information outside of just groups of academics and young people, etc.?
You want all of us to answer that? All of us to answer that? You want to? I'll try to take a swing at that. So thank you for your question. So as someone who started their research studying offline spaces of street activism, those spaces oftentimes are younger people to begin with. So for me, I didn't see that hiccup right away, and that's something that I need to be more considerate of. But the other thing, as we think about access in class, what I find to be really interesting about Twitter, and Andre Brock brings this up, is the ways in which we access the space, right? So when we think about Facebook and the ways we oftentimes access Facebook, it's mostly computers, and cell phones has been picked up later, right? Twitter, on the other hand, started through actually SMS text messaging, right? So as even we think about who has access to computers, Twitter is unique in the sense that it started out with who had access to cell phones, right? And which opened the door to internet access for so many low-income areas, right? So I think when we look at particular locations like Baltimore, Chicago, as particularly I had to just, privilege doesn't seem like the right word, but as Baltimore was going through its thing a few years ago. Yes, thank you. One of the questions I was able to ask, and I wish I would have done this in a more formal way, but was just the tools that they were using to communicate with each other as they were going into the street. And if it was not Twitter, it was some other SMS-based messaging system. So, you know, WhatsApp, GroupMe, these things. So I think the platforms itself has kind of made some of those issues not irrelevant, but different. Yeah. But as far as your conversation around age, yeah, that's something that absolutely I think that's spot on, and it's something I need to look at.
So my work broadly focuses on Black girls in digital spaces. And so even though what I presented today was looking at specific case studies, another part of my dissertation does ethnographic work with Black girls, and I'm based in Richmond, Virginia. So the girls that I work with in focus groups, there are mostly from low-income communities. So I do think that there is, to echo what you were saying about cell phone access, I do think that even though it's not, like cell phones are not like a panacea, but I do think that they do offer access to people who have lower incomes more so than computers. Because all of the girls that I worked with who were between the ages of, they were like middle school and high school age, so we're talking like between 11 and 18, they all had cell phones, even though a lot of them lived in housing projects and places like that. So I think that I do think that the cell phone is a way of certainly not equalizing, but offering more access. And in terms of the question about age, I mean, to be honest, because I do focus on Black girls, I haven't really considered age, but I do present my work to people who are in those demographics that you talk about, because, for example, I have to talk to school administrators when I'm going in to like try to make connections with Black girls, and so I do try to stress to those groups that what Black girls are doing online is important. So that is my way of trying to include older people in the conversation and saying, like, we're in charge of educating these Black girls, we're in charge of taking care of them, and so we should be paying attention to what they're doing online.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Yeah, when I was recruiting and I was putting posters around the public library, I was thinking about age as one of my factors, right, of intersectionality. And so I was also going off of the social media fact book citation that I had up that said it's not just this 18 to 29 demographic that we seem to, I mean, I have focused on in the past in my larger work, but it's also the 29 to 49 demographic of folks that are highly online. And so I had folks all the way across from 18 to 49. Obviously, that's still limiting because it only goes to 49. But the women who were, I can think of one who was 45, and she was just shocked that she was a part of the group. And she, I remember her expressing elation and being there in the conversation about social media. And she wasn't the minority in terms of age. And so that's a step forward. I think it's a perennial question in terms of getting our work out there in public spaces. So like I went back to that library and presented this work. And yeah, so finding ways to have these conversations differently and in different spaces, I think is important.
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely, right. I find it fascinating how reproduce very similar structures of surveillance in the digital that we see in the physical space, particularly about Baltimore, right? You know, the certain intersections that have the light, have the camera and the light, and you know, if you're from Baltimore, you understand exactly that camera and that blue light that's at the intersection, right? So, yes, and yes, right, yes. But I also, so I do want to push a little bit back around the conversation around age and activism and online space, right? So young people, I suspect, gravitate to social media spaces as also a safe haven, if you will, from particular types of respectability politics that get played in their everyday lives, but then also in online spaces, right? So there is a overrepresentation in some spaces, particularly, you know, in the structures that is Twitter, right? You know, I search these things by terms and or by hashtags, so to be represented in the data set, you have to be engaged in either the term or the hashtag, right? So there is a internal external factor, but then there's also an intra-group multi-generational dynamic thing that's happening there that, you know, they produce safe havens from sometimes us, right? So, you know, there's something for us to be mindful of. The surveillance part, I think in some of the other portions of my research, the parts that I found to be most striking and sad in some ways is there's an assumption with activists that they were already being surveilled in these ways anyway. So it gives them a certain level of freedom to do what they were going to do anyway, right? So, you know, without naming names, they already believe that their user ID, their social security number was with the Fed, so I might as well, that gives me a freedom to say what I got to say because they were here anyway, right? I'm not protecting myself anymore from anything, so yeah. Was there other questions? I did see a hand. Are there any other questions? Okay. Oh, I didn't want to make this about like a. No, I think about old people not being represented in all of this is very true. Yes.
But somebody said something that just made me think. That's a challenge to everybody doing this conference. But the key to it might be the librarians. You said that, I mean, wait a minute. There are ways for old people to be involved in all of this, but not necessarily with Twitter or Facebook, but all in young people reading some of that stuff to some old folks and saying, what you think? And they don't know the recorder is on. Or they do know the recorder is on. But in libraries, in my little southern Illinois town, Diana Brawley-Sussin is our chief librarian for the Carbondale Public Library. And she's also one of the principal organizers of the Sparrow Project, making sure that homeless people have someplace warm in the wintertime. And she's doing an awful lot of other social engagement. And the library is open to the homeless all day. Now, they have access to everything in there, including internet. Church basements and libraries, and little 9-year-old great-granddaughters could be teaching their great-grandmothers about a whole bunch of stuff and getting them activated in it. It might be I can't see the screen.
Right.
But baby, now put that on there. Tell them this what I said. There's ways to reactivate the senses of community across generations that you all are talking about all day today, and I heard that speaking for old people. I had to have young people force me into getting a cell phone, getting a computer for my work, and even starting, what do you call those things? Blogs.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Let, let me just say that I've been blessed to be able to work for this grant. And one of the things that we've tried to do, I don't know if I was successful in doing that. Clearly, I wasn't successful doing that within my own research project here. But the grant itself has been about having dialogues with the scholars that have shaped us within a black studies perspective, right? And the healthy tensions of this grant has been, we've been most productive when we've had events and spaces where we were able to bring the author of Theory X in a room and just tell them how their scholarship has shaped us as digital scholars, right? Where we can talk about how, you know, absolutely intersectionality is a theory that should be taken up seriously within the digital, right? That our theories matter within the world of DH, right? So I do hear the critiques around age and the digital, and I think what makes Black DH unique is that, at least here, is that we're trying in some ways. It's an imperfect try. It's an imperfect effort, but yeah, absolutely. Hi. Sure, yes. Thank you. Yep. Let's see what. They're not gonna let it go. So there's something that's happening here that I would be irresponsible if I didn't say. So I think there's a failure of the scholarship in understanding this intergenerationally. I do not think it's a failure of the activists themselves, right? So absolutely, activists are engaged intergenerationally, and so within my work, that's a failure on my part, not the activists. One, two, there has to be a part of this conversation that absolutely younger activists know who's on what platform and why they're on Twitter knowing that, right? That there is a part of this intergenerational conversation is sometimes I need a safe space from my, right, that some of those conversations have been violent in the past in ways that go down that age line as much as up, right? That particularly in the spaces, a lot of the work that I've done being at Maryland has been out here to see that source of tension between a place like Baltimore and a place like PG County when folks who grow up and make it in Baltimore move to PG County and act as if they're not from Baltimore anymore and then talk down to the young people who are still struggling in that space, right? So, yes, I agree with these things, but we also have to acknowledge that there are moments where some of this is just we organize in this space exclusively to have a breath, right? That is not a permanent site of exclusion, but I have to have that breath before I can engage, right? So blame me for the lack of conversation about generations. But the activists, I think, if we were able to have that conversation, to have the evidence for it here, I think we would be more at ease of where they are with this type of conversation. Yep. So I'll push back against that. We absolutely do have control over it. Right. Mm-hmm. Sure. Right. Sure. 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 Sure.
And there's not enough activity, nothing you can do even at the campus and the small group that you can orchestrate is getting that populated to the top of their list where they can see it. So again, this runs into a much deeper algorithmic problem in terms of like how do you curate so that regardless of what you are following or who you are following, the things that are of significance to you immediately in the real world, tactilely, right, is still a functioning part of your visual space. Right. And we don't have control over that algorithmically at all. So how, like, what solutions do we bring to the table? I'm not saying just you, but
Right.
collectively as academics, how do we challenge this without sort of seizing the reins of control from Twitter, Facebook, etc.?
So I would bring you to the work of some of the scholars that are actually here, including particularly Andre Brock, because I would push back against this helplessness and control of algorithms. Absolutely, algorithms are doing exactly what you're saying, but also acknowledge and understand that Twitter changed how it functions because black people were using it differently, right? So there's always this tension between how the dominant order sets something up to be and how black people subvert it, right? So absolutely, these are those algorithms, but absolutely, we know these things and do things differently anyway, that I think having that conversation without the both and in there becomes problematic. Right. Are there any other questions? Okay, so we are 2 minutes over time. I would like to encourage everyone. There's a reception happening at the Clarice right after this. There's food, and I believe there will be. The Clarice is just right next door. We leave out of here and cross the street. Right next door is no more than about 15 steps. No traffic at all. Thank you.